Cool.
Great. Hi, Zodwa. Thank you so much for taking time to have this conversation with me. How are you doing today, this
I'm
morning?
good. Do you know what? I'm doing well. Like today is like an actually like good, calm
Mm-hmm.
day. And
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the reasons why I feel calm is because I had a deadline. And I was like, you know what? I'm not gonna make this deadline. So let me just ask for more time. And now that I've got more time, I feel so much more calmer. So today,
Uh,
like the sun is out, everything is better today.
uh, yeah, definitely. I love this thing about deadlines, how they stress you, and then the moment that you have more time, it's like, oh, now I can breathe. Now I can, just relax and do the thing that I need to do, but with time, without having to chase deadlines.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
exactly. So what made you decide to become a playwright and a director?
I think it's sort of been like an evolving process because
Mm,
for me, I began in poetry and then just learning a lot about expression. And like, this is 2005 and kind of being 17 and like meeting other young poets and just kind of being in that kind of creative space. And I wasn't necessarily kind of studying anything kind of in the creative arts at that point. So it was like kind of this introduction into like, what can you do with words and what can you do with stories?
mm,
And I kind of spent my time with these young authors from like probably kind of 2005 but kind of 2010, 11. And all of that time was spent like writing things but being published, touring and doing shows like around the UK, and then kind of doing shows like in America and doing kind of poetry competitions. And it was like this wonderful experience of kind of learning about expression. Then I kind of discovered um theater, and I started kind of going to the theater like a lot more and learning about like, well, how a story is kind of told in this space and like who tells the story, because in poetry it always been about kind of me. I write it, then I perform it. Whereas like in theater you were introduced to like writers and then other writers and directors, and there's like the technical side of it, and you're like, oh, okay, there's this whole like company of people that makes work. And it begins from you with the idea, then you just pass it forward and you pass it forward, then you offer it up to the audience eventually. So suddenly I was like really fascinated by like this kind of journey of kind of making story, and I wanted to be kind of a part of that. And for like the solidly like the first because this is probably about kind of 2010 now, kind of 10, 11 or so, learning more about kind of theater. And it was mostly, I think, for me about kind of writing, and I think I love that. I love the idea of creating characters and creating these new worlds. And I remember the specific like seeing John Carney's play Nothing But the Truth, and it came to Leeds, and I remember kind of seeing that and seeing a world that I understood and a world that was kind of reflected back to me, and I was like, oh, I can do that, and I want to do that. I want to be a part of that. So that was like all the years I spent writing and loving story and loving characters and world building. The directing thing only really kind of came quite later, specifically with film, and then being really interested in like what can you do with cameras, and how does this medium kind of offer you something different from like what you're doing in theater and like what you were doing in film. So suddenly like I was thinking a lot about like the plays that I was making, and specifically like kind of Nine Lives. And I remember kind of thinking about what's the Nine Lives version in film and what can you do. And like when you're in a space in the play, particular the idea around kind of being displaced and kind of being alone, in theater you can talk about that, but suddenly like in film I was like, oh, visually what can I do that gives us the idea of aloneness, but aloneness like in this kind of like world that you feel kind of excluded from. Where do you then place the camera? Where does like the subject on screen sit in relation to like what's kind of happening like in the wider picture? All of that stuff was like studying about the different crafts. And I think that's what I kind of tend to do a lot of the time, is I kind of just get really like geeky about it, and I'm like, I want to study everything. I want to study everything about poetry. I want to study everything about theater. I want to study everything about film. And I think that's how kind of my skills tend to evolve.
Oh, wow, that's a really, really eye-opening response to how you came to being a director and a playwright. And I love what you talked about, how watching John Carney's play made you
Mhm.
see the possibilities of telling stories that are authentically yourself and about experiences from your own culture and from your own lived experiences. Tell me more about working within the UK as a Zimbabwean born artist who has spent most of their adolescent and adult years in a foreign land, so to speak. I don't know if that's correct to say foreign
Um,
land to you.
it is, because I think it's weird. It is and it isn't, because you're kind of both a product of like where you were born in that culture, but also like where your socialization takes place. And I think you're always kind of navigating like between the two things. And I think particularly kind of for somebody who growing up in England, I think that it's just about what's the thing that makes you feel a part of that place. And I think there's an otherness that kind of happens, and an otherness that happens like on very kind of very different levels. I think for me, one of the major things that kind of made me feel really othered was kind of dealing with immigration, and like the immigration issues that kind of lasted for like the majority of my teens into even into now. So like now I'm at a point. So I came when I was 11, and then put in. I remember our first kind of like immigration application for residency when I was about 16. I didn't get my indefinite leave to remain until I was 30. So like that's kind of massive time where you were
Yes.
growing up and
Mm-hmm.
kind of shaping kind of who you are and your experience of the world. So it was weird even kind of doing like the poetry stuff back in the day, because you're going off to America to represent the UK, but when you're in the UK, you don't feel like you're part of the place because you haven't been given like that passport that says that you're here. So I think my experience always really felt like I'm kind of half here and half not here. So here sometimes, particularly like with the writing, you're very much kind of seen as like a Zimbabwean writer. But I remember kind of even going to Zim, quite early on, like in my writing, and then talking to people about the things I was interested in writing about, and they hadn't really kind of factored in there in Zim because it wasn't really applicable to them, And it was like, I remember one point somebody saying to me, if we're dealing with like, you know, um, trying to kind of survive it, and looking at like kind of the economics and like kind of politics, we're literally thinking about, can we afford bread, whether or not you're going to come here and start talking about like disability rights. Like that's not their primary concern right now. Their primary concern is like, do we have enough money to buy bread? Whereas like in England, I was talking about disability rights. That's just the work that I was kind of interested in, so I think I'm having to kind of navigate these two spaces all of the time. So when you finally kind of find work that finally kind of speaks to you, especially kind of in England, where you're always trying to gain a kind of a platform. I think for me, that's what kind of poetry did. It sort of gave me a platform where I could be heard. And then when you start kind of moving into kind of different mediums, you realize that particularly like for theatre, the idea of kind of programming black work, is like seen as like a risk. Now you go, oh, black African immigrant with with a foreign name. Then you have to talk about like marketing, like all of that stuff was like always so complicated. And it was so unfortunate because it made you feel like as if your voice didn't matter. So you have to fight even harder for it. And I've been reading a book, or one book called Big Magic, and in it says this notion of like there's the arrogance of belonging, and you have to believe that. You have to be in the mindset that this is yours, right? Like you want to be in the space, you deserve to be in the space. And for somebody who had also like studied creative writing and like had gone up to like an MA, I was like, this MA wasn't for free. Like, no, this MA is going to pay back, and I'm going to be in these spaces, and I'm going to have my work produced. So I had to be arrogant in that idea of like, no, I deserve to be here, and I'm going to keep pushing, and I'm going to keep talking to people, and I'm going to keep sharing my work. And it's this constant thing that you're always having to do. And then on top of that, then you go, okay, and now I've dealt with like the idea of the otherness of being an immigrant. Now it's about kind of being a woman. Now it's about kind of race. Now it's about kind of class. And it's just a constant thing that you're having to navigate. And then just being a creative, you then start going, oh, okay, by the way, there's also imposter syndrome, so let's throw all of that in there. So
Yeah.
so many things happening. And I think ultimately what I've had to do is go, at the heart of everything is story. And that's the thing I genuinely love. And I need to be in a mindset where I think that my stories are valid and my voice matters. So I'm going to write things that speak to me. Because if I start writing work that isn't authentic to my experiences, then it's going to be even difficult to do the practical things of actually getting to the end of a draft. Because that's really hard. That process of writing is really hard sometimes. So I better make sure that I love what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely right. And yeah, that imposter syndrome, I think it hits everyone, whatever a point in their career and wherever they are from. So you talked about the challenges of trying to make work in mainstream spaces from a marginal space or from a marginalized community. What are the other challenges that you have faced as a creative, as a director, as a playwright?
I think it's one of the biggest things is probably fear. And fear of, so I guess kind of my own ability, I think. And I think that's probably kind of where imposter syndrome kind of comes in. Because you spend so long like in this kind of marginalized space, whether or not it is about kind of your creativity or it's about kind of your existence kind of in society. So to be brave, and continue to make work has been really difficult, because what you don't want to do is allow like that fear to like overcome you. And then on practical things, I think it's also knowing that living the creative life sometimes doesn't always sort of pay back in the amount of effort that you put in, like just financially. You got to talk about that, and the challenges of that. So for me, a lot of the times, so I don't live in London. I live up north. So I grew up in Leeds. And a lot of the times kind of when I was starting out, everything becomes centralized in London. You know, connections, events are all kind of in London. People are in London. Meetings are happening in London, right? So then you have to think about, well, what's the cost of kind of getting down to London? And who's going to like cough up that money, right? Mm-hmm. And that was always quite difficult, right? So for me, like I had to stay at home. I had to stay at home, save up the money, and know that, okay, cool, when I go to London, I'm going to have this amount of time to do all of these things, in order for me to sort of like be able to feel like I'm kind of part of kind of that kind of creative community, right? And I think kind of the financial kind of challenges of that were really difficult quite early on. And then on top of that, it becomes about like, well, what's the culture that's kind of being discussed of like where work that is kind of valued, let's say. And there was a notion a lot of times that, you know, the work that's kind of happening outside of London just isn't as important, or isn't as bold or as brave or as creative. And it's like, actually, but no, it is though. It's just you have to come out and see it as well, because us always kind of coming to you isn't always feasible. So there's this massive kind of divide about what's kind of happening, and it's still there. You know, it's definitely kind of still there. And I think for me, when I look at like how kind of my career is kind of developed, I make sure that I make more of an effort to connect people who can't necessarily kind of do the things that I used to be able to do, right? Do I pass along kind of information? Do I, you know, now that everybody's on Zoom, do I kind of connect people on Zoom, you know, so at least they're kind of learning these skills and kind of growing, so that at least for like the next generation, you make things better.
And that's absolutely true, that what you said about connecting people, because I'm one of those people that are always receiving emails connecting me to new people, to new opportunities, and I really appreciate about that about you. Yeah. And also even just remembering the first time we met, when I came for the World Stages residency at the West Yorkshire Playhouse. And how for me you came across like this bold person who's not loud, but is willing to speak her mind and willing to advocate for herself, and really push the bounds in terms of what it means to create work within such a space where the liminal spaces are quite narrow. Yeah. And so who has been your greatest supporter? in your journey as an artist?
I've had a few, to be fair. And I don't know whether or not it's like the ancestors looking out. Like, no, there've been quite a few. And I think that it's interesting, it's looking back on it, because for me, like the whole migration thing really, really changed like the trajectory of my life. And I wasn't really going to be in the arts at all. Like, my plan was like, I'm gonna go do psychology. And then suddenly, like, having to deal with like all these immigration issues, and my plan A, which is like psychology, was like pushed to the side, because then I became an international student, and then like the fees was just like insane. So then suddenly I was like, okay, cool. I'm writing now, and I kind of fell into like the arts, and then like I started meeting specifically women amazing, like just so many amazing women. And like in the arts, in poetry specifically, it was like Khadija Ibrahim and Paulette Morris, and they both ran leading authors. And when I went into theatre, I started meeting a lot of literary associates and dramaturgs. And I think in the last 10 years, like, I understand and appreciate a dramaturg. Like, they are amazing. Yes. And they're like part story editors, part therapists. And they help in so many ways. Yes. And like, one of the first ones I met was Alex Chisholm. So it's like it's Alex Chisholm, and this was at the West Yorkshire Playhouse. And then it was Jackie Honus Martin, and then there's been Suzanne Bell at the World Exchange, and then there's Sarah Dickinson at Lambda. Just like these amazing dramaturgs who have held space for me to figure out who I am as a writer, but also to figure out story. And they've sort of said, just because you're doing your second, third, fourth, fifth play doesn't mean you know everything and should be left alone. You still require support. And I think that's been like a really important thing for me, and kind of going through like this journey, because each new project would bring up its own anxieties. So to have kind of these support systems have been really important for me. And then also like having circle of friends, kind of just creatives, who we can kind of discuss things that sometimes, like, if you are working in institutions, you feel like, actually, I need to figure out what's happening in this institution first. So you go speak to your friends and you figure out kind of what are their experiences. I just keep community. And I keep community because I need it. Because being in these spaces where when you're writing, sometimes it's quite isolating. So you have to make that effort to go and kind of connect with other people, because it's hard. Like, this process is hard.
Yeah, definitely it is. And I think what you're talking about in terms of community, I really appreciated having participated in the Almas African Playwrights Conference, and also even running it as the Associate Artistic Director. And also I've also recently been also taking some classes with a company called S.W.Z Players, and just being in a community where sometimes the thing that is bringing you to the space is the writing. It's this love for story, it's this love for creating stories that are really authentic to you. Whilst the experiences might not be the same, whilst the context might quite be different, there is something, like you're saying, quite delightful in having a community around you, a community of support, a community of listening ears. And yeah, dramaturgs, it's a phenomenon that is slowly growing in Zimbabwe. Yeah, because when we started out as directors working with new writers, we ended up being dramaturgical directors. You're doing both dramaturgical work and you're also doing directing work. So really being in a space where you're working with people whose work is dramaturgy. And really being smart about what plays are about, and really zoning in on into what a writer is trying to express with their plays has really been amazing and eye-opening. And yay, they are the most, they're not underrated, but I think we should appreciate them.
Because like, to be a director, that's in its own kind of skill set, right? Mm-hmm. There's something particular about like this kind of in-between space. Mm-hmm. And this dramaturg who kind of exists in this space, who just job is to serve you and serve story. Mm-hmm. And whenever you sort of like, because I think sometimes I used to feel like if I was stuck on something and I was like, oh, it's my job to figure everything out, and I wouldn't say anything, and then I'd meet kind of the dramaturgs and they're like, well, you should have told me, because that's my job. Like, I'll happily spend hours with you just figuring out the piece of the story, and it's not too much work, it's just what I enjoy. Mm-hmm. And when I started kind of teaching a lot more, like in the universities, I realized I love that too. And I think that's the thing I really enjoy about meeting like new writers, because I work with them over the course of like a term, so it's kind of 12 weeks. And you meet them with like just the seed of an idea, and by the end of it there's a script. I love that. And I think for me, I'm able to like track everybody's story because I'm just so excited about like just building like that narrative through line. And I go, oh, okay, so if I enjoy doing that for them, then they must the others must enjoy doing it for me. So I shouldn't be afraid to just go, I need help. Can you just help me figure out story, because it's fun.
Exactly. But I also think it also takes a certain kind of generosity of spirit to be able to give yourself to another person's work, and delight in its growth and delight in its development, you know.
But I think in particular about if you're going to take on that responsibility, then you have to sort of ask yourself, like when you're then helping somebody figure out their story, that you're not telling the story you want to tell. So you yourself have to ask yourself, well, where's this advice that I'm giving coming from? And am I widely read? You know, am I thinking about things from like my narrow perspective of my experiences, or can I take it like where they're coming from? So there's so much of the self-reflection that you have to do as a dramaturg in order for you to be able to kind of hold space for other people.
Definitely. And I think it also does help you to grow as a person, isn't it, being a dramaturg?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
I think that's like my next like evolution. I'm just gonna become a dramaturg.
Yeah, and I think you'll be super amazing because already you connect people. Already you have this insatiable hunger to learn and to read and to find out about worlds beyond the space that you inhabit.